Welcome to today's Melbourne Press Club Author Chat. And our guest today, as Kathy said, is award-winning journalist and news presenter and author of 2 crime novels, Katherine Firkin. Welcome, Katherine. It's lovely to see you on the little screen.
Thank you so much. This is very exciting. It's a bit sad to be coming from another lockdown, but it's still really special to be able to do these sort of events.
Well, we're very lucky that the technology allows us to, and the Melbourne Press Club, to use that hackneyed word, has pivoted so brilliantly into the webinar stream. Katherine, you've had such an impressive and diverse journalism career, starting here in Melbourne. You are a former Herald Sun courts and crime reporter, and you've worked with Channel 9's Today Show and also worked with Channel 7, the Macquarie Network. And more recently, now that you're living in New York, you're working as a freelance reporter and a correspondent for organisations such as Channel 10 here in Melbourne and Australia, CBS, Reuters and SBS World News. I should tell our listeners as well, or our followers today, that Katherine won a Melbourne Press Club Quill Award in 2018 for her coverage of the Bourke Street terror attack. She's also an experienced producer for long-form documentaries and Metro News. And while Katherine's been operating her news career, she's also found time to write crime fiction. Her first novel came out last year, Sticks and Stones. It was published by Penguin Random House. And just recently, her second book hit our bookshelves, The Girl Remains. It's gaining very strong word of mouth. Despite lockdown here in Melbourne, people are still buying books, I'm happy to say. And if you haven't yet read it, I'd urge you to pick up a copy from your local bookstore, especially if you live in Melbourne, because, of course, there's a lot of time on our hands at the moment. This gripping story is set on the Mornington Peninsula around the Blairgowrie and Sorrento area, and is the story of the reopening of a cold case, a 20-year-old cold case in which a teenage girl disappeared after a late night visit to the back beach with a couple of friends. When human bones are discovered, Detective Emmett Corbin and his team are assigned the case, which, as with all good meaty, keep you on the edge of your seat crime drama, is not as straightforward as it first seems. Just to give you an idea of Katherine's star as a crime writer is on the up and up. Canberra Weekly said in its review last year of Sticks and Stones, they declared it a strong debut that marks Firkin out as a writer to watch out for. I'd like to start with the location because, of course, you are a Melbourne girl, and this being set down at the Mornington Peninsula will resonate very strongly with a lot of our listeners and followers today. It sort of reminds me of how in recent years, through the novels of writers like Jane Harper, Gary Disher, more recently Sarah Bailey and so on, how the drama, if you like, of the Australian landscape has become part of crime novels that are doing so well globally. There's been a real connection between readers around the world and the offering of our writers. This is this part of, the Northern Territory in the outback, or this is this part of the southern New South Wales beach coast. And in your case, of course, the Mornington Peninsula. Why the Mornington Peninsula? What was it about this particular area that inspired you?
There's a couple of reasons. The first one, most truthfully, is just it's an area I know really, really well. I was lucky enough to have a childhood friend whose parents had a little beach shack up there when I was a kid. So it was a place where I went when I was young. It was probably the place I first went without parents when I was a teenager. So I had all that sort of silly adventures that you do when you're 14, 15, 16, and you think you're being really brave and you're heading out and about at night and doing silly things. Luckily, I never did anything quite as dumb as what my girls do in this book. But it was certainly a place where I felt like I could put myself into these characters and really make it come alive. The other reason is I really love the dynamic of Blairgowrie. As you mentioned, there's something very special about the Mornington Peninsula. It's such an evocative area. You step out of the car and you immediately smell the tea tree, and you've got all those wonderful moonar trees everywhere. There's something really special about it, but it's an interesting dynamic because it's a real small town and it's sleepy during the winter. You know, there's a lot of those holiday houses are empty. The locals really do know each other. But in the summer, we get this influx of tourists. And so there's that idea of strangers mingling among the locals. And when something goes wrong, it's very interesting. Are the locals going to point their finger at each other, or are they going to immediately presume it's a stranger?
Your first novel, of course, Sticks and Stones, is set in Docklands. And so you're being drawn back to this Australian scape, if you like. And you and I were having a little chat yesterday and thinking about how the Australianness is becoming a part. It used to be 10 or 15 years ago in book publishing that if you came forward with a manuscript, if you wanted any chance of international sales, particularly in the US, you had to get them out of country Victoria or the coast of New South Wales. Now, of course, that's celebrated and it's interesting. And I just wondered what it is about the Australian setting, be it Docklands or be it Blairgowrie, that you think has appealed to a wide range of readers.
I think Australian crime in general is really going through a bit of a moment right now, which is great. You know, we're seeing international recognition for titles that perhaps in the past we mightn't have. And my books are police procedurals, which I guess are the less sexy crime novels at the moment. People do love their psychological thrillers and they still tend to be, you know, the most talked about books. But what I love is that it does feel like Australia is holding readers' interest. I mean, you've got Docklands, which is so, the way I describe it, it's quite desolate, it's a bit grubby, and yet it's modern. And it was quite an interesting space for me to set the first book. But then you've got Blairgowrie, which is sort of so isolated in parts. You know, you only really have to get off those main strips and you are completely alone. There was no surveillance back then when the book was set. There was no mobile phones. So you really had the girls up against the landscape. And I think that works really, really well for an international audience as well as a local audience.
But when did you start your fiction writing journey? And how do you fit it in with such a busy news profession?
I tried to write fiction in my late teens and early 20s, and I had this ridiculous chart that by the time I was 25, I was going to have my first novel published and blah, 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 blah. And I didn't even get close to that. My first couple of novels were so bad. I never showed anybody. I didn't need to. They were genuinely awful. And I kind of put it aside. I got really into the journalism and I sort of figured, well, maybe novel writing's not for me. It was something I'd always wanted to do, but I seemed to be having success as a journalist and really no luck as an author. So I sort of pushed it aside. I only picked it up again maybe 6 or 7 years ago when Sticks and Stones, the plot came into my mind. I just lost my job actually, and I was having a rough day. And I was walking home along the creek in the Docklands, and this whole scene just played out in my mind. It was so vivid. I could see a body along the creek, the Maribyrnong Creek, and I could hear the police talking in my head, which probably just means I'm crazy. But it was so vivid that I dashed home and bashed it all out on the computer. And that scene almost never actually changed, despite all the edits I went through for Sticks and Stones. So I felt like it was always this lingering desire that I've had. And it just took longer than I maybe would have hoped to kind of bring it to life.
Over the years, I've had the enormous privilege of chatting to a lot of fiction writers, and many of them say that what comes into their head first is often a character is just there tapping away at their imagination saying, let me in, or there's a conversation. In your case, it's a scene. And it's what you do with that then. So how does your work how does the process work for you, in particular, you know, in relation to this one?
Yeah, I'm not very good at plotting. I've never had a brain that's very spreadsheety or rational. Probably most people would tell you in many ways. So I always, so far, and with the third book as well, I've started with a scene that kind of really captures me and it feels powerful. Then I kind of take a step backwards and think, well, who are the characters in this? and I play around with them a lot in my mind and also just on pieces of paper. I jot down things about the characters, really little details going right back to when they were kids, what board games they liked playing, what arguments they might have had with their siblings, what footy team they followed. Just lots of little things to kind of make them feel alive. And then I start working with this scene and sort of almost playing it backwards, like how did we get here? What's the motivation and what's going on? That's certainly how The Girl Remains happened. I had that scene which you see at the start of the novel where these three girls, there's this weird tension between them. They head out in the night. They think someone's out there in the bushes following them, but they're not sure. And only two of them manage to make it home. And I just loved that. It gave me chills straight away, but I can't tell you what's going to happen next. I just knew, okay, that's my opening. These are my characters. Now I have to do the more tedious work of trying to work out how would we get to that point and what's going to happen in the present investigation.
And when did the journalism bug bite for you, Katherine?
Oh, that's an interesting question. I actually, when I was at uni, I did internships and work experience and all that sort of thing. And I actually felt like journalism wasn't for me. I felt like it was a bit dry. It wasn't maybe creative enough. But when I started at the Herald Sun, I really fell in love with it. I fell in love with all different aspects of it, mainly that you could just go out and see things, you know, that often perhaps if you were a member of the general public, you don't get to see. Every day is different. Even if you're sitting in courts or if you're sports reporting or whatever you're doing, every day is different. I think it's such a fabulous job and I can't imagine doing anything different now as my day job. And I just love the stories too. The fact you get to just talk to people and that's your job, you know, I think that's fantastic.
Well, I wonder whether it does fuel a fiction writer's mind, that those interactions that journalists are so privileged to have when extraordinary things happen to ordinary people, or indeed when extraordinary people come into your world. And I know you've covered, presidential inaugurations and so on, when you're in that extraordinary setting with incredibly famous people and yet ordinary things are happening around you. I wonder whether watching characters, watching people, and again, getting back to the cops, and I'm sure the characters that you've developed, the team, Emmett's team in this cold case, solving this crime, whether some of the detectives that you met in the early days have formed part of the characters. But what we take as bowerbirds as journalists, people's idiosyncrasies and their experiences, and then we can rehash them. Is it as easy as it seems?
It's interesting because I never have trouble coming up with characters, to be honest. And it's probably for the reasons you just said. I think it's amazing. I mean, I think we take it for granted as journalists, what an amazing job it is in many ways. The interactions you have with people from all walks of life. You may never, ever have come across particular groups of people if it wasn't for this job. And I find that fascinating. I mean, sitting in a courtroom is fascinating. I was always one of the nerd journos that would take far too many notes from what I needed because I was just interested. I was just interested in who these people are and how they've got here, particularly backstories of offenders. I've always found that really interesting. And it doesn't always necessarily come out in our reporting, but I think I've always had that fascination for who is this person? How did they get here? Sometimes I'm even just on a tram and I creepily look at people and start imagining who they are and what they're doing and where they're going and what they're worrying about. So I'm probably scaring people when I do that, but I just find it fascinating. And so I don't have any issue creating characters. I do find the actual, the plotting and the sheer effort to get 90 or 100,000 words down is a huge amount of work. But I'm never there thinking, who's this person going to be? Because I feel like I've met them along the way.
So what is your fiction writing process then, Katherine? Are you quite organised? I mean, Jane Harper, again, a Herald Sun alumni who's now a successful fiction writer, she told us in this same scenario a few months ago that she does have a particular work pattern in her day. And because as a print journo, she's so used to writing 1,000 or 2,000 words a day. So there's a certain discipline. How does it work for you? What does your working day look like?
Yeah, I'm not as successful as Jane Harper, so I don't I don't have whole days to write just yet, but hopefully I get to that point. So I'm still fitting it around everything else. So it really changes. I am an early bird, so I do tend to get up and get as many words down as I can first thing. And then whatever else comes up along the way, I then often have to scrap it. My brain doesn't work after about 7 or 8 p.m. So I've learnt there is no point forcing things. If I do anything at that point, it would just be jotting down thoughts about characters or plot twists or things like that. There's no point even trying to edit at that point because my brain just turns to mush. But I'm definitely a morning person. For people who are trying to write, I would definitely suggest getting the words down before anything else. It's that sort of pay yourself up front or pay yourself forward or whatever the expression is. Get the words in the bank before the rest of the day kind of starts crashing in on you.
How difficult was it for you for the first book to land a publishing deal? And how did you go about it? Because I'm sure a lot of people will be taking notes on this one.
Yeah. Well, I think this was the journo side of me. I straight away went, it's all about who you know. It's all about networking. I've got to meet some people in the industry. I didn't want to just send my manuscript out to what they call the slush piles of all the publishing houses, because you really run the risk of the wrong person picking up your manuscript. Even if your manuscript's great, you're really hoping that the right person happens to pick it up at the right time. So I spent about a year looking around for events where I could actually meet some people in person to have a chat with them. At one of those events, I met my agent, Jacinta DeMarze. She signed me up almost immediately and then did a wide submission to all the publishers on my behalf. And I'm really, really lucky that my manuscript, she popped it on the desk of Bev Cousins at Penguin, and Bev rang me almost instantly. I was actually working that day for Channel 10, and I was literally like ducking under police tape at a crime scene when my phone rang, and Bev was like, "It's Bev from Penguin. I need to talk to you." And I was like, yep, no, I'm not busy at all, trying to navigate this scene, waving at my cameraman to just go shoot whatever. But she said to me right from the start, there's something really special about your writing, but it needs a lot of work. And I really liked that because I felt like this was someone who was actually going to be invested in making me better. Whereas some of the other publishers were just excited by the manuscript as it was, which is great. But I really knew that I didn't want to just get one book out. I wanted this to be potentially a new career or at least an ongoing opportunity for me. So I knew I needed to have the person that was actually going to really push me. And I felt that with Bev at Penguin.
And we have a question from Joseph Mizuraka in our audience who has said, Katherine, have you ever considered writing creative non-fiction or a non-fiction book based on a court case? And, of course, a couple of great exponents of this art come to mind, Helen Garner and Chloe Hooper and so on. Have you given much thought to that style?
Truthfully, right now, it's not that appealing to me. And I think it's only because I am still working as a journo. So I still feel like I've got that non-fiction kind of style already as my day job. And then the creative outlet, it really feels like a release for me. And that's what I like. Quite often with the stories we cover in the news, we can't have the endings we want, and we can't always necessarily tell them the way we want to. I'm trying to be diplomatic how I say that, but I'm sure everyone who knows what I'm talking about knows what I mean. Whereas in a novel, you really truly can create the world that you want and tell it the way you want and give people the airtime that maybe we can't in real life.